The day was like a day with all the small events, easy difficulties, and unimportant joys. And still, near the end of the working day, fatigue accumulated, and ahead was still a shopping trip for groceries with all its consequences. Nancy set the heavy bags on the table with a sigh. Had she really been able to carry them by herself? Only her hands were burning and her fingers had no flex. Nancy immediately walked over to the sink and opened the water, putting her hands under the cool stream. Oh, it felt so good. The heaviness in her reflected hands was letting go. Standing by the sink, Nancy looked at the bags. She frowned. It was payday. Usually her husband would pick her up after work on a day like this, and they would drive to the supermarket to buy basic groceries for another week. This time, however, Nancy had not been able to reach him, and he in turn had not called back either. She thought he would be waiting for her outside when she left the office, but his car was gone. So Nancy went to the store herself. Of course, she had bought a lot of stuff, hoping Charles would call. But he was still out of range, and Nancy had to take a cab to get home with all those bags. The cabbie was a nuisance. He got grumpy when Nancy asked him to help her put the bags in the trunk. He wouldn't help her carry the bags to the elevator. And even though she said she'd pay him extra, that I was a porter, you don't need me to pay you extra. My job is to get you to your destination, and then you can do it yourself. And anyway, my back hurts. Good thing they fixed the elevator the day before. If it wasn't for the elevator, there's no way she could have carried her bags to the 7th floor. Or she would have, but she'd have broken her back or injured her arms. God, where the hell was Charles? She thought in her heart. And then Nancy heard the sound of the front door opening. Charles came into the kitchen a minute later. His face was calm and peaceful, unlike his sleepy face. His face was calm and peaceful, as opposed to sleepy. The woman looked at him with a squint and said wryly, "Well, hello, you're just in time." Charles looked at his wife, perplexed, not understanding what she meant. "Why are you looking at me like that, Charles? Have you forgotten what day it is? You were supposed to pick me up so we could go to the supermarket together. And you haven't picked up the phone all day? I've been calling and calling and calling to no avail. What happened?" Charles looked guiltily at the bags on the table. "Oh, I'm sorry. I completely forgot to call you. I had an urgent job. The chief gave me an important urgent assignment. I couldn't refuse him and I've been busy all day. Didn't even get to the phone. Wow, I guess it must be dead." Following these words, Charles took the phone out of his pocket and said cheerfully, "Yes, that's right, it's dead." "That's what I thought. I'm sorry. I'm really dizzy today. I'm so tired. I'm so tired. Let's get something to eat. And then, as usual, we'll plan the budget for the near future. Then I'll go to bed. I have to get up early again tomorrow." Charles went to the bathroom, and Nancy looked at him suspiciously. It didn't look like he was tired. He looked very fresh and rested, and cheerful too. It all seemed, at first glance at least, too suspicious. Oh, this is not good at all. However, her suspicions about her mistress might turn out to be correct. Nancy had been watching her husband's behavior very closely for some time now. They had been together for a number of years, and she had studied his behavior almost thoroughly. So the slightest changes in his demeanor and nuances in his attitude toward those around him, she noticed immediately. He had been acting strangely for more than half a year, often going out and coming back quite late. At such times, he would carefully pick out his clothes and stand in front of the mirror for a long time. Nancy wasn't jealous enough to ask questions like, "Where did he go?" But when it began to happen more and more often, she couldn't stand it anymore. "Where do you always go in the evenings? On business?" "Nancy, business. You know I'm a businessman. I have a lot of acquaintances with whom I have to consult, negotiate solutions to serious problems, agree on joint actions. It is only thanks to this that I can successfully conduct business," my husband confidently replied. It should be said that these words meant the hobby of the husband, which he invented a few years ago. They had just bought an apartment, invested the money equally, and after that the husband started investing. Nancy did not understand anything about such things, trusted her husband and let him manage all their money. It was the same in her family, so Nancy did not worry. Charles gave the impression of an intelligent and judicious man. Every month he would tell his wife happily how successful he had been with this or that money transaction. And Nancy was proud that her husband was so clever and lucky. He estimated that if they invested a certain amount of money each month, they would have so much money saved for retirement that they could spend the rest of their lives doing nothing but traveling for pleasure. Sometimes Nancy would strike up a conversation with him about children. After they were married, they decided at once that they would not have children for the time being. Charles reasoned that it would be better to get some stability first, because going on maternity leave would mean that they would no longer be able to save, and a child would require some spending, and that meant that they wouldn't be able to save any more money. Nancy agreed with him. But time passed. Their financial situation stabilized, but they still hadn't started planning for children. Nancy, it's not time yet. We need a good financial cushion, you know? I'm not sure what we can do yet. It's not worth talking about yet. That's how he answered her question about the baby. And everything went back to the way it was. Well, have you played out the dinner yet? Nancy heard. Charles' voice came from the bedroom. No, I'll call you when it's ready, shouted Nancy in response. She looked sadly at the bags and then sighed. Something she was tired from the day. Yes, and in fact she was just tired. Perpetually satiated. Budget planning, menu planning for the week. Increasingly, she wanted to just get her paycheck and enjoy it. Go to a cafe, eat delicious cakes or go shopping. Or at least just come home, put the money in her jewelry box, and not have to think about how to divide it up in bumps. 10 minutes later, dinner was warmed up and the couple sat down at the table. They dined in silence. Each was immersed in his own thoughts. Nancy did not know what her husband was thinking, but his face was so peaceful. It felt like she was clearly not the reason for his happy smile. Nancy thought again about the supposed mistress. What if she was right? What if he really did have someone? Nancy didn't want to believe it, but many facts indicated that it was quite possible. After dinner, Charles, losing the palms of his hands from each other, cheerfully said, "Nose, let's begin our procedure." This phrase meant that they would now plan their budget for the near future. Nancy cleared the table. Charles pulled out a thick notebook and a calculator from his desk. Nancy had told him more than once that it was possible to do the math on an app on his phone. But Charles had sternly replied to her that all monetary calculations had to be done on the calculator. "This is not a toy, Nancy, this is serious business." Every month, Nancy gave her entire paycheck to her husband. He would combine it with his own, and then calculate in his notebook how much they needed for food and utilities, how much for the inevitable daily expenses, how much for necessary purchases or entertainment. Everything was recorded, all the remaining amount of free money. Charles would take it for himself. He would put this money into his special account and then invest it in the form of investments in various projects. Nancy had never once seen it all happen. She trusted her husband completely. At first, these monthly calculations were a joy. They both could almost physically feel their safety cushion increasing. Then the process began to feel like a chore. Now, however, times were somewhat different. Nancy was beginning to worry. This was partly because she suspected him of cheating. There was no clear evidence, however, and Nancy had not yet sounded the alarm. The whole procedure of meticulous calculation took nearly half an hour. Then her husband folded the money for the monthly investment into a neat bundle and put it in an envelope. "Tomorrow I'll put them in the account," he solemnly uttered. Nancy washed the dishes, moved to the kitchens, and then took a shower. When she got to the bedroom, Charles was already wheezing, turned away against the wall. Yeah, and they'd been in a lull in bed for a couple months now. It had been about a year since they'd both had any passion, or at least any mutual attraction. No, they made love from time to time, of course, but it was all so boring, quick routine. Nancy would even say there was a coldness to their relationship. I guess all couples who live together for a long time go through such a period, but Nancy still thought it had come too soon for them. She lay in bed, immediately closing her eyes. Needed to put all the problems away for the next day. Now, it would be good to just get a good night's sleep the next day. When Nancy got free after work, she decided not to go straight home. She wanted to go to the mall with her husband this weekend to look for a winter jacket. Nancy decided not to wait until Saturday. She called her husband to warn him, but he didn't pick up again. "You've been too busy lately, Charles," she whispered to herself. She decided not to call him again. Why? Nancy was sure she would get home even sooner than he would. She drove to a large shopping center where there were many stores. Sometimes some of them had good discounts. Nancy liked this mall very much. When she went inside through the main entrance, she felt like she was entering another world. In places like this, everything was so festive and dressy, but really sometimes very expensive. And yet, she loved the noise and the hum of voices. Men and women in hand, shopping bags. How she wished she too could go shopping so carefree like this, buying whatever came to her heart. But as a rule, Nancy went to this mall only for certain things and to a certain store. Only occasionally did she allow herself to just stroll around the complex like that, looking in different boutiques and pretending that she could buy herself absolutely anything. Sometimes she even tried on some particularly expensive and beautiful things that were not yet available to her. For example, she went into one fur store with trepidation. She liked everything there, but she especially liked one half fur coat, which she had tried on 3 times already. That day she wanted to go in there too. Nancy sighed and joined the crowd. She just walked into almost every store in a row. Looking at the fancy clothes, she thought sadly that with the rest of her salary, which her husband had put into investments, she could buy some very even decent things. And even like this one, for example, an expensive handbag that was just begging to be picked up. Nancy looked at herself in the mirror with a slight smile as she held up the purse. Oh, how good it was, but she didn't even have anywhere to carry it. She and her husband hardly ever went anywhere, and it wasn't suitable for everyday use, too dressy. Nancy looked in the stores that sold winter jackets. She couldn't find anything suitable for her. She left the store and headed for the cafeteria. She wanted a cup of coffee. On the way, she stopped by a boutique that sold furs. Right in the window there was the fur coat that she liked so much. She had wanted to take another look at it last time. The woman stopped in front of the window, but there was no fur coat. There was only a mannequin. What a pity, someone must have bought it already. Nancy looked inside the store with regret. She saw a woman standing in front of the mirror in that particular coat. So there she was, this woman, trying on the coat that Nancy liked so much. Standing next to the woman was probably her husband. Apparently he had sponsored the purchase of the expensive item. The woman fidgeted in all directions and then turned to her companion with a smile. The man turned to say something to her, and Nancy was stunned. It was her own husband. Standing next to the woman was Charles. He smiled at the woman and nodded, looking her over from head to toe. It was clear that he approved of his companion's choice. Nancy could not believe her eyes and watched them in a kind of stupor. The woman threw herself on Charles' neck and he embraced her. It was clear that the purchase had taken place because her husband reached into his pocket for his wallet. Nancy took a few steps 5 at a time away from the shop window, continuing to stare at her husband and the woman. Then she turned around and walked away. She walked down to the first floor and out of the mall. She didn't wait for public transportation, but got into the first cab car she could find in the small parking lot. While driving home, Nancy tried to regain her senses. It was only at home that she was able to realize what had happened. Yes, she was right. Her husband had a mistress, and he had been shopping with her. He was buying her the fur coat that Nancy liked so much. He was buying the coat with the money they were saving. And Nancy was forced to go to the mall and just lick. Charles spent a lot of money on this woman, and his wife could not even keep a part of her salary to buy herself something. After all, the husband kept telling her to save money, to save up, to save up, to save up. Airbag. For what? So he could spend it on another woman. Yeah, that was interesting. Nancy drank a glass of water and sat down at the table. She wondered what were the pros and cons of their married life. They lived quietly and peacefully. Yes, but was it as good as it was thought to be? It turned out that the peaceful life often led to the husband looking for adventures on the side. Is that it? Or was he simply bored of living with Nancy? Or had he fallen in love with this woman? And in what interesting way was this woman better than Nancy? Age-wise, she seemed the same and looks were ordinary. Only Nancy was a natural blonde, while the woman had dark hair and an unremarkable figure, no imposing form that could so attract a man. The end of married life, then. Nancy wasn't going to tolerate her husband's infidelity in silence, and she didn't really want to have a fight. It was time to talk to him straight, which she was going to do when he came home. Charles didn't arrive until 02:00 hours later. He greeted his wife calmly and said, "I was late again today. There was a very important, urgent matter." "Yes, very important. I realize it's a matter of urgency. It's better to do it right away than to be late." Nancy responded immediately. Charles frowned and asked, "What does that mean?" "What do you mean?" "Yes, and bear in mind that buying a fur coat is a very urgent matter. If you like the coat, you have to buy it right away, or someone else might buy it. That's how it is with me. I really wanted a fur coat and often came to look at it. But then I came and another woman was already measuring it. A man bought it for her, and that was it. I no longer have my favorite thing I've been eyeing for so long. That's an unpleasant disappointment. Don't you agree?" Charles turned pale but did not answer. He just looked at Nancy as she continued to speak. "But wait, I haven't told you everything yet. And you know what the worst disappointment is when the coat you like is bought by your own husband. But it's not for you, it's for his mistress. That's really nauseating." Charles had a face like he'd been frozen. He turned even paler, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't say a word. "Why don't you say anything? It's like you've got water in your mouth. Nothing to say. And I think I deserve some explanation." But Charles didn't say anything. He just watched his wife in silence. Nancy stared at him for a few minutes, then turned away and poured herself a cup of coffee. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "Did you see us?" Nancy turned to him again and hummed. Well, did he at least have the courage to admit it? "What? Did you think I was telling you the plot of some movie?" "Of course I saw you, and I think you'd better tell me the truth, since it's already clear to me. I hope you have the courage not to lie to me." "I think I deserve to know the plain truth, don't you?" Charles sighed. His face had regained its natural color, and he no longer looked as frightened as he had at first. Apparently, he realized that Nancy would not make a huge scandal. Charles sat down at the table and asked in a steady voice, "What do you want to know?" Nancy had a lot of questions running through her head, and she didn't even know what to say to his question right away. "Was it your mistress?" she said at last. "Yes," Charles answered briefly. "How long have you been together?" "About 1.5 years." "Nancy." A lump rose in her throat. "Were you going to tell me about her?" Charles hesitated a moment, but then answered, "No, we weren't actually going to. At least not anytime soon. If she demanded it, he'd tell her." "Did Nancy close her eyes?" "Yes, that meant they were serious. If this woman wanted to be with him all the time, she would easily get the result she wanted for herself." "I see." There was nothing else she wanted to know. She thought about asking if he still loved her. But she changed her mind. Why ask if it was already clear? She sighed and said, "Well, then there's only one way out. I think we should get a divorce. What do you think?" Charles looked into her eyes, and Nancy was very surprised by what she saw in them. No, there was no regret there, grief or unhappiness. There was fear, some kind of fear. And it wasn't fear of losing his wife, but something else. Nancy couldn't understand why Charles reacted the way he did. At first, she thought he didn't want to lose his family after all. But then Charles said, "Yes, that's probably for the best. If you want to, let's evolve." Nancy realized that was the end of it. She was hurt. But better to be alone than with a husband who walked around on the side. She couldn't say she'd felt much love for Charles all the years she'd been married, but they had lived together for more than a year and were not satisfied with each other in bed. But the passion between them hadn't been there for some time. I guess that's what happened to a lot of people when love started to fade. She would have moved on with him because she was happy with almost everything. But if he had a mistress, it meant that he was certainly not satisfied with everything in their marriage. Nancy, as they say, she didn't find herself in a dumpster to be a man's backup. She thought they were a family. Turns out their marriage had been broken for a long time. At least for 1.5 years now. It was better to end it all at once, no matter how unpleasant the pain. Nancy helped with her eyes to keep the tears from appearing. "All right, since this is the way it's going to be, let's talk through the details right away. We need to agree on what we're going to do with our property." Charles spoke slowly, and Nancy saw the same fear in his eyes again. So that was what was bothering him about the division of property, and she thought he was sorry that their marriage was falling apart. "Yes, with the property and with our money," Nancy said confidently. "With the money," Charles repeated. Nancy frowned. Why were his eyes racing? What was going on? "Maybe we could talk about this later." "I'm very tired today," the husband said. His behavior was suspicious, and Nancy immediately decided to find out. "Tired of what are you tired of? What are you tired of coat picking your version of? Tails." Of course, this case is so serious, requires full commitment. "No, we're all talking now. There's nothing more to talk about. I've already found the best option, even two. All you have to do is choose. We don't have kids, so that makes the divorce easy. All we have to do is divide the apartment. And I'll tell you what, I'll keep the apartment and you can have all the money we've collected, or vice versa. You keep the apartment and you give me all the money. That's my rough estimate, because you don't show me your calculations on a notebook. I've got just enough saved up to buy an apartment, just like it. I think it's fair, and we won't have to go through a long divorce. If we settle things amicably." Nancy looked questioningly at Charles, who turned pale again. Nancy began to suspect that something was wrong. Why was he so nervous? "You don't know what to choose." "Well, think about it till tomorrow then. Then you can tell me. But there's no point in thinking any longer. I don't care what you choose. I'll take any of them. There's nothing to think about. We only have one option, unfortunately. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. You see, we can only split the apartment in half. That's all. That's all we have." "What do you mean, just the apartment? What about the money?" "Ah, do you want us to go through the courts? You realize I'll still get half of it. But all this will only prolong the divorce process," Nancy said angrily. She thought he wanted to torture her a little, but it was worse than that. Charles said something she never expected to hear. "There's no money. We can't divide it up because it's gone. I've lost everything. Nancy, we lost everything. I'm broke. You see, I lost all our savings. I invested in one business, but it failed, and I lost everything. I'm sorry, but I didn't know how to tell you." Nancy jumped up from her chair, resting her hands on the table, her whole body thrust forward, and hovered over her husband. "How's that? You've got to be joking, haven't you? How is this possible? Do you realize what you've done? It was all our money. Every month, I gave you my entire paycheck. I denied myself everything. You never gave me any fancy gifts, and I accepted it. I hoped that soon we'd be able to afford a lot of things. I trusted you, Charles. What did you do?" Charles shrank back. He looked at his wife apprehensively. He clearly feared that she would physically attack him. But Nancy only pounded her fists on the table as her arms ached. She sank helplessly into a chair. Now she couldn't take it anymore and cried with resentment. It was so both unfair and cruel. She had hoped so much that with these monthly infusions of money they could secure their future. And now all the money had gone down the drain. Her husband was not as smart and lucky as she had thought. After a few minutes, she was able to say, "I will never forgive you for this. You not only ruined my life today, but you destroyed all my hopes for a better future." Nancy looked at him angrily. "Well, there's only one option left to us now. We have to share the apartment. I have no idea how to do it properly, of course, but there's nothing else left for us to do. You've left us no choice. We'll discuss the rest later. I want to go to bed. I've got a bad headache. If you want dinner, you can find your own food. As long as we still have a common refrigerator and groceries in it, you can look for something there and sleep in the living room. From now on, I'm sleeping in the bedroom. Okay, I won't mind. If you go to live with your mistress, if she has a place to live, she doesn't have her own apartment, she lives in a rented one," Charles replied grimly. Nancy snorted. "Why didn't you find a rich mistress? Or did you find yourself so unwanted? Of course, you have no money at all. What can I do with you? What would you buy today with what money, I wonder?" Charles got quiet and answered quietly. "It was money borrowed." "It was borrowed money." Nancy raised her eyebrows. "You borrowed it, but you're a jerk. Well, now stay with your debt. That's it. I'm tired of talking to you. I'm going to bed." She studied on the bed for a long while longer, trying to realize and make sense of everything that had happened to her. In just one day, she had lost her entire family, her husband, her money, and almost her apartment, because now she would have to divide it in half. And what would happen to her next? She was just afraid to imagine. Nancy and Charles divorced quickly. The whole time before the divorce, Nancy couldn't wait to finalize everything as Charles was still living in the same apartment with her. Nancy did not understand why he did not leave for his mistress. As soon as they received the divorce certificate and property division papers, he took his things and moved out. They divided the apartment equally. Now one part belonged to Nancy and the other to her ex-husband. It was unclear what to do next. Nancy wanted to buy out Charles' part, but she didn't have the money at the time. If Charles wanted to buy out Nancy's part, she would not agree, because she could not buy anything decent with that money. And she was sorry to lose her cozy, spacious place. When he moved out, she breathed a little freer. Would the apartment issue be resolved somehow? Charles had a place to live, and she would raise money to buy the second part of the apartment. But it wasn't that simple. Nancy was in for a surprise she never expected. One not-so-great day, a month after Charles had left, the doorbell rang. Nancy opened the door. A strange woman stood on the doorstep. She looked at Nancy with a slightly defiant look. Her face seemed a little familiar to Nancy, as if she had met this woman before but couldn't remember her. "Hello, did you want something?" Nancy asked in a friendly voice. "Yes, I did. I need to talk to you," the woman replied without greeting. Nancy frowned. "What exactly is it you want to talk to me about?" "About the apartment," the stranger replied. Nancy assumed that she was Charles's lawyer and that she had come to find out what to do about the apartment. Nancy invited the woman in. The woman entered in a businesslike manner, carelessly removed her shoes, then began to walk around the apartment as if she had been invited to inspect the living space. Along the way, she peered into the kitchen, bathroom, and living room. Nancy remained silent. She just didn't know how to react to this. But when the woman looked into her bedroom, she couldn't stand it. "Who gave you permission to walk around?" "Everywhere." "I don't understand who you are. Identify yourself and tell me what you want from me." "Did my ex-husband send you here?" Nancy asked angrily. The woman slowly approached her. "I suggest that you go to the kitchen and discuss it there, without waiting for Nancy to move first." The woman walked into the kitchen by herself. Nancy followed her impatiently. "I'll tell you once again to introduce yourself. Otherwise, I will be forced to ask you to leave." The woman sat down in a chair, put her foot on her leg, put her purse on the table. Then she looked at Nancy, raised her head proudly, and said, "To my good fortune and to your regret, you can't send me away, because I'm the rightful owner of half this apartment." Nancy turned pale. She didn't understand what was happening. "Who the hell are you? What the hell are you talking about? I'm going to call the police, and they're going to throw you out of here. My name is Molly, and your husband gave me title to half of this apartment. I'm here to tell you that I'm going to move in and live here in my rightful half." And then Nancy remembered where she'd seen this woman. She'd seen her at the fur store. She was Charles's mistress, the one he had bought her favorite fur coat for at the time, the one Nancy had dreamed of. She came here to live here. What is this nonsense? "I don't understand you," Nancy whispered. Molly was starting to get annoyed. "God, she's stupid too. What's not to understand? He sold me his rightful half of this apartment. Now I have as much right to it as you do. And I'm going to live here, informing you in advance so you can vacate the room where your husband's office used to be. Your bedroom is a little bigger, but I don't like the window. I like the other room better. That's where I'll be living. We'll take turns using the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom." That would be more convenient, wouldn't it? Nancy realized that Molly wasn't joking. The woman was really asserting her rights at this point. "No, you're not going to live here. I won't allow it. Go to my ex-husband, Molly, and live with him." "I'm not letting you in here." Molly smiled and said sweetly, "First of all, we weren't on a first-name basis. But since it happened so suddenly, I'll keep it that way. Secondly, my name is Molly, and I gave you no right to call me by my first name. I can only be addressed as Molly, and no other way. But thirdly, it's my own business who I live with and where I live. And for the moment, I'm going to live right here. My furniture and bags will be here in a week. You can't stop me, so I suggest you just accept it. If you try to interfere, I'll have to come here with the law." Nancy was at a loss for words. What the hell was going on? It's the brazen broad, coming to her house to sway her supposedly legal rights. How was that even possible? How could she get her ex-husband's share of the apartment? "I can see you're shocked by my statement, but I can't help you. I'm going to live here, period. It's just a set of circumstances. Who knows, maybe I won't like it and I won't stay here. Maybe something else will come up. Anyway, next Saturday I'm moving out with my stuff." Molly stood, picked up her purse, and silently left, slamming the door loudly. Nancy sat staring at one point for a long time. Then she called her ex-husband, but he didn't pick up. Nancy called a friend of hers whose husband worked for the police. She told her about her situation. After a while, the acquaintance called back and said that Nancy could sue her ex-husband. But all this would drag on for a long time, and she had no right to kick out her ex-husband's insolent mistress. If this woman really was the mistress of part of the apartment, Nancy realized from the paperwork she had pretty much lost this battle. The main question on the agenda was how to live on. A month went by and her ex-husband still hadn't returned her calls. Molly moved in with Nancy. She didn't say much about her ex-husband, but she was obviously in touch with him. Close, that's for sure. Nancy realized they were up to no good. They were after something. Molly was a rather strange person. If at their first acquaintance she behaved in an impertinent manner, in the process of living together she began to show herself in a different way. Nancy often noticed that the woman behaved unconventionally, and she was so uncomfortable that she even tried to go to the kitchen less often, so as not to meet her. And Molly's oddities manifested themselves in many things. For example, she arranged small glasses around the kitchen with cheese sticks inside. Before that, she walked around the apartment with 2 of them. The only one she didn't go into was Nancy's bedroom, because she told her not to. Before Molly moved in, she had even put a keyed lock in the door of her room so she could lock the door when she wasn't home. "Molly, why are you wiping the whole house with your sticks? It stinks." "What is that?" "It's a special compound designed to exorcise spirits and all manner of evil." Nancy just laughed. "You're making that up. Where would the spirits come from? What kind of imagination do you have?" Molly, however, replied in all seriousness, "You shouldn't laugh. God, I know what I'm talking about. I'm a witch, and a hereditary one at that. People often come to me for help, and I can not only cleanse a house or a person from all evil, but I can also make a spoil myself. I feel that the energy here is not very clean." Nancy frowned at what she was carrying. However, then even stranger things began to happen. Nancy began to often find strange objects in the most inappropriate places. For example, a piece of black dermatite in a box of laundry detergent, a bundle of some unknown herb in a cosmetic bag. Nancy didn't understand where these things came from, and Molly just shrugged her shoulders when Nancy asked her about them, without asking stupid questions. "Nancy, I have nothing to say to you. I told you there's something weird going on in this apartment. I can feel it." But when Nancy found in the pocket of her jeans, which she had taken off the dryer points, tied up dark hair, some kind of dry stick, she started cursing. "I told you not to go through my stuff. Don't you get it? Are you stupid or what? What the hell are you putting me through?" Molly was being insolent. She said she was doing it for the greater good. "Look at you, flaring up, acting crazy. I put these things where there's a lot of negative energy. And I don't care about you. Don't think about it. I just want the apartment to have its own positive energy." "What energy? I'm sick of you. You come into my house, you invade my space, and you do all kinds of crazy stuff. What do you want from me? You're insane," Nancy raged. Molly got angry and raised her voice too. "What right do you have to insult me like that? I do what I want. In fact, if you want to get rid of me, sell your share and you can go on your way. And if you keep insulting me like this and undermining my authority, I'll be all over you. Yeah, what are you looking at me like that for? It's the truth. I can and will do anything if you come out and get me." So that's it. Nancy figured out what this crap moved in here for. So they were planning to take away the only thing Nancy had left, her rightful half of the apartment. And Molly was deliberately approached by her ex-husband to execute their plan. Or Molly herself planned the whole thing and conspired Charles into signing over his half of the apartment to her. What kind of creepy person is her ex-husband? And this woman, she's a witch. We should be careful with them. Nancy was slightly frightened by everything that was happening. What if this woman really was capable of everything she was voicing? Her strange actions spoke for themselves. What if she was also purposely planting all these strange items for the purpose of casting spoils? Nancy, by and large, did not believe in all of these things. But what if it was all true? What if they were up to something terrible? You couldn't show this witch your fear. We have to fight it some other way. We have to think of something. Nancy laughed as natural as possible, though it was hard enough to make something up, some nonsense. What kind of spoilage? I don't believe in all this nonsense. It's all made up just to scare people. Impressive people believe it and make up even more nonsense. But I'm not one of those people. I'm a sensible person, and I don't care what you say. I'm just not even going to pay attention to them. You're just a stupid woman, that's all. And you're not going to scare me, and you're not going to make me voluntarily sell my part of the apartment. There's no way I'm going to do that. No matter how hard you try, just tell that to my former asshole who's now on your leash. Oh, that's the man. That's the man. A real gentleman didn't want to work it out with me. He sent out his own. I don't know what to call you, Molly. Molly thanked with anger and rage. She hadn't expected such a comeuppance from her lover's ex-wife. Ah, you don't care. Well then, we'll see how you sound after I prove things to you. Since you talk to me like that, I'm not going to tit for tat with you anymore. I offered you to settle things peacefully. And now you're talking to me like that, and you're laughing at me. I'm not going to let it go. Look out. And Molly went to her room. And the Nancys wondered. Yes, perhaps they should have been wary of that woman. If she and Charles were up to something, they couldn't be trusted, and they had to protect themselves. And then Nancy thought about something else. Was everything as her ex-husband had said? Had he really lost all the money they had saved together for years? If he'd blatantly lied to her, if he'd just wanted to pocket it all, and now he wanted the apartment too? It could very well be true. Nancy sensed that Charles and this woman were willing to do anything. If that was the case, then Nancy should have started to worry. She did not believe that her ex-husband's mistress was really a witch and sorceress, as she solemnly called herself, but she could very well have been a criminal who was capable of anything just to achieve her goal. You could see in her eyes that she was a wicked and self-serving person. And there's a reason she came to live in her apartment, so she must have had some serious motives. Why would she want to be around Nancy all the time? Well, probably not just to take over the sleepy part of the apartment, but to do physical harm if Nancy didn't agree. Nancy decided that the best way to keep track of her illegal roommate was to put up a security camera. She would then be able to observe Molly's actions and have evidence of criminal behavior on hand. The next day, Nancy found a craftsman who was willing to install a video camera outside the house to monitor Molly. The cost of such entertainment was a bit expensive for Nancy in her current situation, but she thought it was worth it. When Molly wasn't home, the handyman installed the camera. It only took about 20 minutes. Nancy was worried that Molly might suddenly return. She had a cover story for that, saying it was the meter reader. She even warned the master about it, but everything went well. The camera was installed in the kitchen, and Molly did not suspect anything. That same evening, Nancy started cooking dinner. Molly showed up. She made herself some coffee and slowly chased the hot beverage while watching Nancy. The woman got tired of this and angrily asked, "What's the matter with me? Don't you have anything else to do?" "I want to watch and look." "Are you trying to boss me around?" "I'm as much the mistress here as you are, and don't tell me what I can and can't look at." Nancy didn't say anything while she was cooking dinner. She watched Molly with a sidelong glance and caught Molly's gaze several times. Molly looked at her coffee mug several times and it looked suspicious. "Nancy, you're supposed to." The whole time Molly sat next to her, staring at her phone. But occasionally she would cast brief glances at the mug on the table. Nancy caught the dishes behind her. She decided to leave the kitchen so she could see what Molly would be doing in the meantime. Nancy went into the bathroom, closed the door behind her, and turned on the water. She washed her hands for a few minutes, then stepped out of the tub. Molly was still sitting in her seat as well, but she had a satisfied look on her face. Nancy picked up her coffee mug and said, "You're pissing me off. I'm going to go have coffee in my room." She left for her room, taking the mug with her. Molly stayed in the kitchen. Nancy closed herself in her room, turned on her computer. She found a program through which she could watch the footage from the video camera. The footage was only stored for 2 days, the foreman had said, but that would be enough time for her to review the previous day. Now Nancy reviewed the tape 10 minutes and back, putting it on a slightly accelerated mode. A few minutes later, she saw herself leaving for the bathroom. From that point on, Nancy turned the tape back onto normal playback mode. She saw something that literally shocked her. Molly waited until Nancy had closed herself in the bathroom, and then immediately stood up, walked around the table to reach Nancy for her coffee mug. She pulled a small bag from the pocket of her tracksuit. It contained bright blue capsules. Molly opened one of the capsules and poured its contents into Nancy's mug. She then put the bag of capsules back in her pocket, took a sushi stick, and gave the coffee a good stir. After that, sniffed the contents of the mug as well. Apparently satisfied, she broke the stick and slipped it into her pocket, then sat back down. Nancy looked with horror at the mug that stood on the table in front of him. What a nightmare. Had she stirred something into her coffee? She wanted to poison her. Nancy covered her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming in terror. What was there to do now? Nancy watched the tape one more time, and then another. She watched it about 10 times before the fear and terror left her. During the time she watched it, she was finally able to pull herself together and began to map out a plan of action for herself. If they decided to do this to her, then Nancy will also act decisively and harshly. She will not let these two scoundrels, her ex-husband and his mistress, deceive her or harm her in any way. Nancy decided that she would try to outwit them herself so that she would get back everything she had almost lost undeservedly. The first thing she did was to save the tape, send it to her work email, and commit it to her computer. After thinking for a few minutes, she copied it to a flash drive too. She now had 3 copies of the recording in different places, which was a good start. Next, Nancy was left to think about what to do with the poisoned coffee. Naturally, she wasn't going to drink it. But how do you make Molly think she drank every last drop? And what, she wondered, was she stirring into the coffee drink? It was hardly poison. They needed to intimidate Nancy, and they didn't need to kill her to do that. They just needed to poison her a little or make her sick, but they didn't know the cause. Nancy relied on her intuition. She looked down at her coffee mug again and barely audibly whispered, "It's unbelievable how this can happen to me. It's like I'm starring in a TV show." Then Nancy pulled herself together. She couldn't relax. She had to take action. Then she would succeed. She looked around for a place to dump the poisoned liquid. Surely Molly would be watching her. Would Nancy come out with an empty mug or not? The woman scanned the space around her, and then an empty vial of body lotion caught her eye. There was only a little bit left at the bottom of the bottle. Nancy put on some music so she couldn't hear what she was doing. She opened the bottle, carefully poured coffee into it from the mug of spilled liquid she carefully wiped up with a handkerchief. Then she carefully closed the bottle and placed it on the shelf. After a little thought, she took a jar of alcohol and poured some onto the table, wiped its surface thoroughly. There was little chance Molly had slipped it to her. Maybe it wasn't even supposed to be touched. Then Nancy took a deep breath, looked at herself in the mirror hanging on the wall. She didn't look scared, but there was a slight worry evident on her face, and it was pale, which was just right for her plan. Nancy picked up the empty mug and walked out into the kitchen. Molly was still sitting there. When she saw Nancy, her gaze first darted to the mug, and then the woman began to stare at Nancy. She saw that Nancy had placed the empty mug in the sink. A look of triumph was written all over Molly's face. Nancy frowned slightly and rubbed her forehead. I put too much coffee in the mug. I drank it, and my heart feels like it's pounding hard and I have a headache. Maybe I'm sick. My body feels a little stiff and weak. I'm going to go to bed early. Hopefully it'll be gone by morning." Molly didn't say anything. Nancy went back to her room and went straight to her computer. She saw Molly do a couple of dance moves. You could see how pleased she was that her plan had come to fruition so quickly. Then Molly turned on the water in the sink ostensibly to wash her hands. But in reality, she directed the water stream into an empty mug to wash away the remnants of the poisoned drink. Then the woman headed to her room. Nancy could not sleep, and then she had nightmares from which she kept waking up. After 6, she didn't sleep anymore. She kept thinking about her fate. How did she get into such a situation? Her life at that moment was like a comedy, a circus, and even a detective. The only thing missing was an audience that would watch the development of events with interest and laugh during the demonstration of particularly funny mise-en scene. Nancy hoped that the ending would be happy. She had absolutely no need for drama. At 07, 00 Nancy got up to get ready for work. Molly was also out in the kitchen when she heard Nancy rattling the dishes. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Nancy looked at her. Wow. She didn't even bother to hide her interest. She hadn't cared for Nancy before, and now suddenly she cared, or had a conscience, or was just waiting for Nancy to get sick. What were those capsules anyway? What do you care? You'd be happy for me to get sick. Not good. I don't feel bad. Are you happy? I'm going to the doctor today. Maybe it's just a cold and I just need to stay home and rest. Molly didn't answer anything. She hummed and went back to her room. After work, Nancy did go to the doctor, but for a different reason. She had her annual checkup with a neurologist. She had herniated discs in her lumbar spine. She needed to take care of her health so that the situation would not worsen. But this time she wanted to go to the hospital for preventive treatment. The doctor had long ago advised her to do so, but Nancy kept postponing and postponing this moment, thinking that she would still have time. However, as it turned out, in the current situation it was the most appropriate moment for this. She talked to the doctor, and in 2 days she had to go to the hospital, and she would be given a sick leave. All in all, everything was as it should be. Satisfactory. She drove home. As soon as she started to prepare her dinner, Molly came into the kitchen and immediately asked Nancy, "Did you go to the doctor?" "I hope it's not a cold." "Tony, I want to catch it from you." Nancy shook her head in the negative. "Don't worry, it's not a cold. The doctor didn't find any abnormalities. Yes, and in fact it was all gone from me by the middle of the day." "I don't know what it was, and why do you care so much about me that you're already hooked on me?" Nancy smirked. Molly shrugged irritably. It was obvious that she wasn't very happy with Nancy's condition. "Here's another painful need for me. I'm worried about my health. If you're sick, you should take some medicine for prevention." Nancy didn't answer anything. She made herself some coffee, then went to the bathroom to take a shower. 10 minutes later, she came out. Molly was sitting at her desk in front of her computer, looking at the news on social media. Nancy picked up her dinner plate and cup of coffee and went to her room. She ate with gusto while watching the footage from the video camera. 15 minutes ago, Molly did the same power manipulation she had done yesterday. She stirred the weed into her coffee again. There was nothing else of interest. Nancy saved the recording again, and Molly's movements in triplicate, then erased the rest of the unnecessary recordings and stared at the coffee mug again. Then she pulled an empty bottle of body lotion out of her bag. She had taken the bottle with her to work. There she had poured the entire contents into the toilet to rinse it out. Now she poured all the poisoned liquor back into the empty bottle. What? Are we going to start pretending again? Nancy went out into the kitchen. Molly watched her with interest. Nancy didn't say anything this time, but made a face like she was feeling much worse. By the sink, she staggered a little and hit an empty mug on the table with her hip. The mug fell to the floor but didn't break. Nancy stared at the crumb with an uncomprehending look and said nothing. Molly frowned and looked at her carefully. "What's wrong with you? Are you not feeling well?" Nancy lost her eyes and frowned. "Yeah, I'm not feeling well again. I must be sick after all." Molly opened her mouth but couldn't find anything to say. Nancy went silently to her room, moving very slowly and with a kind of lethargy. She went to bed quietly, confident that Molly had fallen for the trick. The next morning, Nancy left for work. Molly didn't that time in the morning to see how Nancy was feeling, who calmly worked all day, then warned everyone that she was going into the hospital for a week. She then called the hospital and went home quietly. That was the day she was scheduled to perform the third act of her play. Nancy arrived home. Molly immediately came out of her room. She looked at Nancy carefully but did not say anything. It was obvious that Nancy was feeling quite normal. Nancy changed her clothes, brewed herself some natural coffee, then sat down to drink it right in the kitchen. Nancy could barely contain herself from laughing when she saw the disappointed look on Molly's face. The woman could see that Nancy had no intention of leaving the kitchen. Now she couldn't put poison in her cup. Nancy then decided not to disappoint her roommate. She pretended that she needed to make a phone call. She went to her room and called her friend, asking her how things were going. Nancy watched what was happening in the kitchen through the CCTV camera. The third act took place. Molly used the third capsule. Nancy saved the recording again. She then finished talking, returned to the kitchen. She sat down at the table and began stirring, with a spoon, the coffee drink. Molly immediately retired to her room. Nancy immediately poured the rest of the coffee into the sink, washed the dishes, and retired to her bedroom. About 0500 hours later, she went into the kitchen, sat down at the table, and began to decree. After a few minutes, Molly looked behind her back. "What's the matter with you? What's keeping you awake?" Nancy groaned again and muttered, I'm getting sick of this. I'm not feeling well again. I'm going to the hospital in the morning. I don't understand what's wrong with me. I'm getting worse and worse every day." Molly pretended to be concerned about her well-being. "Of course you should go to the hospital. You don't know what's wrong. You'd better get yourself checked out. Could it be something contagious?" Nancy staggered slowly to her room. She packed a bag of things for the hospital, taking her laptop with her. The thumb drive she had hidden before at work, all the important documents for the apartment, her passport, and she took all her money with her too. They might try to break in her room door while she was away. It was around 0700 when she hailed a cab to go to the hospital. She wondered to herself how events would unfold next, what other surprises awaited her, and would she be able to get out of this story unscathed and preferably with a profit? All these questions were still unanswered. But Nancy was sure that the final act would soon come. Only Nancy didn't realize that it would come even faster than she had anticipated. Nancy arrived at the hospital, was checked in, and assigned to a single room. Since the attending physician was the husband of a good friend of hers, they had been friends for a long time, which was why she had gotten such a comfortable room. She asked the doctor to have her laptop and all her documents hidden in his office. Rick was very surprised, but Nancy told him, "Trust me, it's the most valuable thing I have right now, and I need it safe and sound, and no one else can get to my stuff here and now. You're the only one I can trust." Had Nancy known how timely she had given the laptop to Rick, she would have patted herself on the head. After taking the tests, Nancy lay down in the room and fell asleep. She woke up around 11. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw two figures beside her. Nancy didn't even realize who it was. Checking her eyes, she recognized them. It was Molly and Nancy, Charles' ex-husband. Their faces were, to say the least, very solemn. In fact, they were clearly jubilant. Charles gently held his mistress under his arm, and Molly held her head high as if she were royalty. When Charles saw that his ex-wife was awake, he smiled slightly and said sweetly, "But hello, dear Nancy. It's so good to see you." As ambiguous as it sounds. "I'm sorry I haven't returned your calls. I've been a bit busy, but Chris has been keeping me up to date with all the happenings. So as soon as you left for the hospital, I came straight over, Molly, and we decided to visit you. How are you feeling, taken over so suddenly?" Nancy had already recovered. Of course, she hadn't expected to see them at the hospital. She thought their meeting would take place outside the hospital walls, and they'd come early to deal with her. Maybe Molly thought she might have had too much soda. Maybe they were afraid she'd die before they could work things out in their favor. But Nancy wasn't going to die. Nor was she going to just give up. She was ready for battle, and soon it might be clear which one of them would prevail. Nancy frowned and said in a weak voice, "Yes, I'm not feeling well at all. I don't know, like someone's jinxed me. I feel all right, and then I get sick. Doctors say there's something wrong with my heart that needs to be checked out to find out the exact cause. It's all on me at once. I feel like I have no strength at all. I can't even get out of bed." Molly cast a quick, worried glance at Charles, but he signaled to her that everything was under control. Then Charles turned to Nancy again and said, "You see, darling, you've made sure now that you didn't have to go against us. You see how it turned out. After all, Molly warned you that you'd be sorry if you didn't do as she asked. She told you she was a sorceress and that she'd put a spell on you. But now, I hope you're convinced that it's all true and that we weren't joking. You see, the spell will work until it kills you. And there's nothing you can do about it. No, there is something you can do to save your life. You can sell me your share of the apartment. I'm not asking you to just sign over your share to me. No, Nancy, I'm not an animal. You need a place to live, so we'll buy your share, but only for a very modest sum. Don't worry. You should be able to afford a room in a communal apartment. I think you'll be fine. Or maybe you'll find someone and they'll add some money to it, and you can even buy a studio apartment. But I take it you don't have anyone right now. Molly would know that. So for now, a roommate will do for you. And once you sign the contract, Molly will lift the spell and you'll be healthy and strong again. But how about that? I think it's pretty fair. Don't you think so? There's a price to pay for health, so you're going to pay us. Are you ready to sign the contract? I even brought it with me. We can sign it quickly, and you'll be able to check out in a couple of days. Nancy listened to her ex-husband, and there was no limit to her surprise. But wow, how they had calculated everything. They had come with the expectation that Nancy would immediately sign the necessary papers. And of course, tomorrow she would feel perfectly healthy because the poisonous substances would stop working, and she wouldn't get any new doses. How calculating and greedy were those two, and they found each other. How many years had Charles hidden his true nature? But now Nancy saw his face uncovered. It glowed with greed and triumph. He wanted to dominate and humiliate, to take and destroy them. Then he looked so happy. Nancy had never seen him so happy. All these years she had lived with a man who pretended to be someone else, apparently who she wanted him to be. Nancy realized there was no point in pretending anymore. She climbed up on the bed, getting comfortable. Her face immediately took on a different look. She squinted and asked me just one question, and how's Crisco? Oh, sorry, Molly. How is she going to break the spell? Probably with red honey capsules. Molly turned pale and looked at Charles. And he had a smile sort of glued to his face. Well, that makes sense. If you poisoned me with blue capsules, the antidote would be red, wouldn't you? Oh, I'm so stupid. You're not going to give me the antidote, are you? You're just not going to put the blue capsule in my coffee anymore, are you? And I feel better immediately. And I'll believe that I really was jinxed by Molly, the great sorceress and 7th-generation hereditary witch. But only before that I will sign the contract prepared by you, and you will pay me the promised pennies, and you will get an apartment, and I will be on the street, and you will celebrate your triumph. Only I'll be locked up in a communal room for the rest of my life, and maybe even grief, which will please you very much. But why don't you say anything? I've told you everything correctly. Or are there any inaccuracies? I may be wrong about a few little things, but other than that, I'm right? Charles. Angry and Molly went pale. They were both breathing heavily. Charles' mistress was ready to pounce on Nancy and upset her face. But then Charles pulled himself together. He grabbed Molly by the arm and angrily said, "What the hell is this nonsense? You're out of your mind. It's all just in your imagination. It's nothing like that. There were no capsules. No one would believe you." Nancy laughed. For the first time in a long time, she felt so confident. Fear transgressed on the faces of the two lovers. They were clearly afraid. Then they had something to be afraid of. Then Nancy was on the right track. She crossed her arms over her chest and said, "Do you think I'm a fool? I've seen it all. I know Molly put some kind of poison in my coffee. You think I drank it?" "No, of course not. I knew right away that your mistress didn't just show up at my place. I knew right away you were up to something bad. I just couldn't figure out what it was. And then everything fell into place. I knew. I knew I wouldn't let you deceive me." Charles was terribly angry. He never expected his ex-wife to find out. "You can't prove anything if you tell anyone we deny everything. No one's going to believe you. You'd better sell us your share without delay," angrily she whispered to him. Nancy smiled back at him. "Honey, I can prove everything. I have a videotape of Molly putting something in my coffee. I have all 3 videotapes. I've prepared myself for the possibility that you might come up with something like this. And I put a CCTV camera in the kitchen. I can see you're surprised, scared, which is a very good thing. And don't even think about searching my room or the whole apartment. Yes, you'll find a video camera, but I kept all the tapes in triplicate and in different places. You won't find anything at home, and 1 copy is already with a friend of mine. He's an investigator. I even wrote a statement, and it's already signed by me. If anything happens to me, it'll go straight to trial, and you'll both go to jail forever. I also gave him the coffee, and I had it analyzed. So my friend knows everything. He told me all the evidence is enough to put you away for a long time. Do you understand? Or should I call my friend the coroner to confirm everything I said?" Well, you call him. Charles, Molly were burned to death. They didn't see it coming. Their plan fell apart like a house of cards, and everything was ruined by Nancy herself, who at that second was looking at them with mockery. The lovers were silent for a while. Molly clenched and clenched her fists. She was ready to strangle Nancy immediately. But nothing could be changed with that. Nancy had been able to back up herself and her life. But they had underestimated her. And now they had to pay for what they'd done. And it was up to them to decide what happened next. Nancy made them realize they had a choice. Charles pondered for a while how he could get out of this situation with the least possible loss. He looked around but didn't see his ex-wife's laptop anywhere. Nancy was glad that she had given it to the doctor to keep. Charles finally decided that he had to act very quickly, or Nancy might come up with some new option. Okay, you got it. We're leaving right now and don't show your face again. Molly's gonna get her stuff out of the apartment right now and move out. You can go back to the apartment in peace. We won't bother you anymore. Only you're going to give us that tape and take back your application. Nancy raised her eyebrows in surprise. You're taking me for a fool again, Charles. You know I'm not. Or have you lost your mind? Charles whispered a swear word with feeling. What else do you want then? That you want me to give you my share of the apartment. Is that what you want? Yeah, I guess that. Okay, you got it. We'll give you the whole apartment. I don't want to know you anymore. I've never met a more disgusting woman than you. We'll sign a contract, and then you'll give me all the records. But this time, Nancy shook her head. No, Charles, I don't want this apartment. I want something else. You know, for all your shenanigans, not only could I put you in jail, I could take it all away. But I'm not like you. What they don't want is my legal half. That's what I want. You understand me? Yeah, I know you tricked me. I know you pocketed all the money you and I put away every month. And you told me you lost it all. I used to offer you two options. You get the apartment, I get the money, or vice versa. But now I only want my money. I'll give you the apartment in full. I don't need it anymore. I have too many unpleasant memories of it. I don't want to live there anymore. I won't be happy there. You and your Molly have desecrated it. You can live there on your own now. You can even keep everything that's there. I'll only take my clothes and money, of course. That's my final decision, and it's not even negotiable. As soon as the money is in my account, I'll destroy all records and you'll never see me again. I'll go to another city forever. Charles didn't even have anything to say. He just didn't have the strength to resist. He realized that Nancy wouldn't believe him anyway. Charles, Molly looked at each other. Nancy had left them no choice. They realized they had lost, and if they didn't go along with it, they had a lot more to lose. Charles turned to his ex-wife and said sullenly, "We agree." When Nancy came out of the hospital a week later, everything had been finalized, the documents had been signed, and a large sum of money was already in her account. All she had to do was to get her things out of the apartment. So she did. Charles, Molly were waiting for her at the apartment. Nancy gave them her keys. The lovers watched grimly as Nancy calmly packed her clothes into her suitcases. Nancy didn't admit to them that the whole story about the investigator's coffee expertise and the signed statement was pure fiction. Of course, Nancy was taking a risk when she threw it all in their faces because they might not believe it, but she'd been lucky. She hadn't made a mistake. Everything turned out just as she wanted it to. The packing was over very quickly. As Nancy carried the suitcases to the landing, she took one last look at her ex-husband and the woman she was forced to live with in her apartment. Those two had nearly made her life a living hell, and Nancy considered herself extremely lucky that it had ended that way. Her only wish was that those two would never get in her way again. That was why she wanted to move to another city. She looked at Charles, then at Sorpus and Molly. Goodbye. She didn't say another word. The lovers didn't answer her at all. When Nancy took the elevator down her suitcases, she left 3 of them by the cab car, dragging the other 2 to the dumpsters. They were unnecessary items. She put them separately. The cab driver watched her while he guarded the remaining suitcases. When Nancy left the suitcases by the trash can, she felt so free, as if she had been relieved of a heavy burden. That's just the way it was. Nancy was going to put the past behind her. A while back, she'd cheated with her university friend. She had her own firm and was just looking for a deputy. She had offered Nancy the position, but it required the woman to move to another city. At the time, Nancy had said she needed time to think about the offer. But now Nancy did not hesitate. She called and said she accepted. Her friend got excited and said she was expecting her any time. In the morning, Nancy booked a plane ticket right from here, and she was going to drive to the airport to fly to another city and start a new life there. At work, she called and warned everyone about her departure. She had the money, she didn't even have to look for a job. Everything was working out in the best way possible. Nancy took one last look at her suitcases and walked back. The cab driver looked at her questioningly. "You can load the car with these," she told the driver. He quickly loaded 2 suitcases into the trunk. One he put in the back seat. Nancy got into the car. The cab driver started the engine and asked, "Where are we going?" "Ma, I am." "To a new life," Nancy said quietly, looking ahead. "Where to where?" The driver asked again. Nancy looked at him and smiled embarrassedly. "Excuse me, could you take me to the airport, please?" 3 years passed. Nancy rode in a cab and looked out the window curiously. She tried to find some change, but she hardly found any. Everything in this town was still pretty much the same as it had been 3 years ago. The first time she'd been back here in that time had only been on the anniversary of a friend forcing her to come here. She had been in frequent contact with Lisa. Her friend had come to visit her 4 times over the years. But Nancy herself did not want to return to her hometown because it was no longer her hometown. She became truly happy where she lived now. She had met her love and was about to get married. She had a prestigious job and new and loyal friends. She was doing well, but Lisa tearfully asked Nancy to come to her for her anniversary, and the woman couldn't refuse. Driving along the main street, Nancy sadly noticed that many buildings were in a deplorable condition. They needed urgent repairs, but no one was in a hurry to do it. Yes, the city was falling into disrepair, sad as it was. Though she didn't live here anymore and would never return, that was for sure. They pulled up to the right house. Nancy paid the cab driver, giving him a generous tip. He carried her suitcase out, placing it next to the girl at the entrance. "Maybe you'd like some help carrying it up to the apartment," he suggested politely. Nancy shook her head with a smile. "There's no need to meet me. They will." "Thank you. All the best to you." The driver said goodbye politely and drove off, and Nancy sat down on the bench. She wanted to sit and breathe the air for a while, and then she would call Lisa. Nancy had lived with her for a while after she moved in, but she had found a suitable apartment for herself pretty quickly. It was even better than their apartment where she and Charles had lived. This apartment was cozier, freer, and brighter. Sure, it cost more, but it was in a new complex. The girl offered to lend her the missing amount. Nancy quickly gave her the borrowed money. In a short time, the girl brought Nancy up to speed with her firm. And in just a few months, Nancy turned professional. Now work was a pleasure for her. Though she was tired, she knew that she would be rewarded for everything. She was relearning how to live. She was teaching herself how to spend money on herself. Charles had never let her do that, and at first it was hard for her to buy anything. But she worked at it every day, and eventually she was able to change. She was a different Nancy now, and she looked completely different. About 2 years after she moved in, Nancy met a man. It happened at her friend's birthday party, who had invited her friends and acquaintances to celebrate the event on a large yacht. They partied until almost morning, and there Nancy met Mason. He was a friend of the friend's husband. Nancy had never met him before, because he lived in Europe, but not so long ago he returned to Russia. There was an immediate sympathy between them, and they started dating, although Nancy had no intention of doing so, but she couldn't resist his charisma. And she missed the embrace of a man, and she wanted to be loved for real, and so it was. They fell in love. And then Mason proposed, and Nancy accepted. Her life had changed drastically, and she didn't even remember her past. That's why she didn't want to go back to that town, didn't want to remember anything. But she couldn't refuse Lisa either. "Nancy," she heard from above. Nancy looked up, saw Lisa on the balcony, and waved at her. "I'll be right there," Lisa shouted. Lisa and her husband came down quickly. Her husband took Nancy's suitcase. The women sat down on a bench. They wanted to have a little chat without witnesses. "I'm so glad you came, dear Nancy," she smiled. "You know, I guess I'm glad too. I needed this. How are things with Mason? Has he run away from you yet?" Lisa asked jokingly. No, really? I'll tell you more than that. He proposed to me, and we're getting married soon. When we decide on the date, I'll invite you and your husband to the wedding. You're coming to see me, Lisa. I promise he will. I'm paying for the round-trip tickets. I really need you to be with me. At that moment, Lisa took Nancy's hand. Fool, what do I need your tickets for? I don't need to pay for anything. Of course I'm coming. What kind of silly questions are these? How could I leave you at such a crucial moment? I didn't leave you the first time. I won't leave you again. Nancy frowned slightly when Lisa mentioned her first marriage. Lisa immediately invited the language. But why had she mentioned it? After all, she had asked Nancy not to remind her about Charles. I'm sorry, Nancy, I forgot. It's okay. They were both silent for a moment, thinking of their own things. Then Nancy asked hesitantly, Do you know anything about him? Lisa realized it was about Charles. She nodded. Yes, I know all about him, but you asked me not to mention him or tell you anything about him, so I don't. Nancy ducked her lip and then asked how are she and Molly doing? Have they at least had children? Lisa gave her friend a sidelong glance and asked, Do you really want to know? To tell you everything I know. Believe me, it won't be what you expect to hear. Nancy wanted to shake her head negatively. But there was such intrigue lurking in Lisa's words that curiosity moved in. Okay, go ahead and tell me. Lisa began her narrative. Charles had only been with Molly for 6 months, and it hadn't been an easy 6 months. When she was his mistress, that was one thing. But as his wife, he couldn't stand her for long. This wasn't you, who almost always agreed with her husband. Molly didn't want to give Charles her entire paycheck, and the man didn't like that right away. He figured he could boss Molly around like he bossed his ex-wife around, but he was terribly disappointed his common-law wife was not going to dance to his tune, and she was always telling him you cheated on your wife. What's to stop you from cheating me? Are you going to screw me over like last time? It won't work. I'm not going to let that happen. And Molly lived by her own rules, not telling Charles where she'd been or what she'd spent the money on. Charles hated it so much. They got into constant scandals. Charles even started to raise his hand to Molly. She'd retaliate. Neighbors often complained about them and even filed a police report. But nothing changed. They quarreled all evenings, and at night there would be a stormy reconciliation. The next day, the situation was the same. God, he never behaved like that with me, Nancy said quietly. Because you put up with him, and Molly wouldn't comply. She made it clear right away that she didn't want to marry him either, Lisa replied. And then even stranger and scarier things happened. Charles got fed up with Molly and she found a lover. He was in some kind of gang. He quickly turned Molly around, and after a while she told her common-law husband that she had sold her part of the apartment Charles had given her. At some point, they never got the paperwork reissued. Charles had at one time registered his ex-wife's share on himself, but he legally gave his part to his mistress, and it was formalized. So Molly sold her share to some gangsters. She moved out of the apartment with her new lover. Charles was left alone with 2 huge rich men who moved in instead of Molly. Oh, he's had it. He's been through so much horror. Until those thugs drove him out of the apartment, they wouldn't rest. Charles sold them his part of the apartment for next to nothing. Some time ago, that was the amount of money he wanted to buy Nancy out of his part of the apartment. Now he had to get that paltry sum himself and lose the apartment. Jesus, Nancy whispered. Charles had somehow managed to buy a room in a communal apartment. It was a tiny room with no room for furniture. It was the room he'd been living in ever since. He was constantly fighting with his neighbors, who banged on the wall every time he just talked on the phone. It was inaudible in the dormitory. Charles is working, but is slowly starting to drink. He thinks that his life has failed because he just hasn't gotten the right women. And he still thinks he will meet the one woman who will obey him unconditionally and who will fulfill all his wishes. Nancy shook her head. I hope he will not meet such a woman in the world. I wouldn't wish to meet such a tyrant. How do you know all these details? My husband is in touch with him. They fell silent. And then Nancy said quietly, What do you think would happen to me if I were still with him? Lisa frowned and, after a little thought, replied, I don't know. But nothing good, that's for sure. I'm so glad you two broke up. Even though you're far away from me, I'm so glad you're happy." Nancy and Lisa hugged each other. "I'm glad too," Nancy replied. They sat in silence for a few minutes, and then Lisa perked up. "Oh, why me? You must be tired and hungry, aren't you? And I'm still keeping you outside. What a jerk. Let's go home. I'll feed you and tell you about our plans for the 4 days you'll be staying with me." Nancy shrugged. Freeing herself from the painful memories, she put thoughts of her first husband out of her mind. Well, he'd gotten what he deserved. It was what he wanted. He had wanted Nancy to be left with nothing, but he had driven himself to the bottom of the barrel. He'd essentially put himself in the position he wanted to put Nancy in. And he had only himself to blame for that. Nancy shook her head and said, "Oh, and I'm not tired. Almost. Maybe we've had breakfast, we'll go shopping later. I'd like to give you an anniversary present. I hope to buy you the prettiest dress in town, so you'll shine the brightest at your party." Lisa laughed loudly, tilting her head. How happy she was that her friend had come to visit. And Sanja smiled, looking at her. Well, they're going to have a lovely weekend. And then Nancy will go back to herself, her fiancé and her favorite job, and everything will be just fine. She and Mason will get married in a registry office, have a fun wedding, and go on a honeymoon somewhere by the sea. And make sure there's some mountains nearby. After all, it is so great to walk in the morning on the mountain slopes among pristine forests, breathe the purest mountain air, then go downstairs with an appetite to dine in some quiet restaurant, which of course must have a veranda overlooking the seacoast. And in the evening to go to the beach, free of most bathers, and go holding hands and looking at each other lovingly, along the water's edge to the side, exciting in its evening sunset beauty.